Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you the new science fiction stories for you, and new adventure, new world.
They cataloged every species in the known galaxy by the sound they made when threatened. The Vreth clicked their mandibles. The Sorvani sang low, subsonic frequencies that turned stone to powder. Even the small, six-limbed Palori would hiss in a register that made the air itself flinch. Every species had a threat sound, a warning, a declaration of self. The humans didn't make one. That should have been the first sign. The Galactic Cooperative had a filing system for new species, and by the time the humans applied for provisional membership in the 4412 cycle, the system had processed 11,206 intelligent civilizations. It was a good system, thorough, color-coded by threat assessment, biological classification, and what the intake officers called cultural volatility index. Essentially, how likely a species was to start a war within their first 50 cycles of contact. Humans came in at a 2.3. That was lower than the Palori, who were 3 feet tall and mostly ate fungus. Arbiter Prime, Sevicolin reviewed the intake file on a Tuesday. Not that humans had yet infected the Cooperative's calendar with their 7-day cycle, but history would later note the irony. She was a Veruan, which meant she had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond across her forehead, a lifespan of roughly 400 cycles, and the particular brand of institutional arrogance that comes from spending 2 centuries inside a bureaucracy that had never once been wrong about anything important. She read the file. She set it down. A 2.3, she said to her aide, a young Vreth named Skisek who was still in the clicking excitedly phase of his career. The Palori scored a 6.1, and they once launched a religious war over the correct fermentation period of a root vegetable. The humans do have significantly more advanced weapons than their CVI suggests, Skisek offered, clicking thoughtfully. Their nuclear capacity alone, every species develops destructive capacity. That's not aggression, that's just physics. Sevicolin waved 4 fingers dismissively. What concerns me is the psychological profile. They have no unified threat response, no collective alarm signal. Their military units function in, what did the surveyors call it? Improvisational clusters. Improvisational. She tasted the word like it was slightly off. They improvise. In combat. Yes, Arbiter Prime. That's not a military doctrine. That's a malfunction. She approved the provisional membership anyway, because that was her job, and because a 2.3 CVI meant the humans would be useful in the lower council seats, present enough to satisfy the diversity protocols, harmless enough to ignore. She assigned them 4 seats on the Cooperative's Developmental Committee, which was the political equivalent of giving a child a toy steering wheel while the adults drove. She did not assign them any seats on the Defense Strategic Board. She would, for the rest of her 400 cycle life, think about that decision every single day. The Integration Academy on VethCOR was where new cooperative species sent their best. Not their politicians. Politics came later, after the diplomatic groundwork was laid. They sent their soldiers first. That was the cooperative's foundational logic. Before you trust a civilization with trade routes and resource access, you learn how they fight. You put their warriors in a room with everyone else's warriors, and you watch. What you were watching for was compatibility. Could their military doctrine interface with cooperative standard protocol? Could their officers follow chain of command? Could they absorb tactical information in real time, communicate under pressure, integrate with units that thought differently than they did? Most species failed the first cohort evaluation. The Sorvani failed because their combat frequency interfered with Vreth communication arrays. The Palori failed because they kept trying to resolve tactical scenarios through religious arbitration. Even the Keth, who had been in the cooperative for 300 cycles and were considered model citizens, had failed their first cohort integration because their concept of personal space in a battlefield context was entirely incompatible with anyone else's. Failure wasn't a disqualification. It was data. You learned what a species was, you built protocols around it, and eventually you made it work. The human cohort arrived on a gray morning, which on VethCOR meant the second sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, and the temperature was sitting at approximately -4 in their Celsius, which humans apparently found brisk rather than incapacitating. There were 12 of them. The cooperative had requested 24, but Earth's Provisional Council had sent 12 and a note explaining that they preferred to assess the program's value before full commitment, which the Academy's intake coordinator, a veteran Veroan named Proctor Daleth Voss, found either admirably pragmatic or deeply insulting and couldn't decide which. Daleth Voss stood at the intake yard and watched them come off the shuttle. He'd processed 47 species in 18 cycles at this post. He had a system. You could tell almost everything you needed to know about a species from how their soldiers walked off a transport in unfamiliar territory. Did they move in formation? Did they scan for threats? Did they cluster or spread? Did the dominant individuals push to the front or hang back? The humans spread out. Not dramatically. Not the aggressive territorial spread of a Keth unit, where they'd practically been measuring sight lines. Just naturally. Like water, finding level. Some are talking. A few were looking at the sky with an expression Daleth Voss had learned to associate with what humans called taking it in, which was apparently something they did with their eyes when they found something aesthetically interesting. One of them wasn't doing any of those things. She was standing still at the edge of the group. Not separate, exactly, but set apart in the way a load-bearing wall is set apart from decorative ones. Average height for the species, which put her shorter than every other sentient in the yard. Dark hair cropped close on one side. Eyes. The cooperative files had noted that humans had a frankly excessive number of eye colors, which still struck Daleth Voss as biologically extravagant. A dark, flat brown that reminded him of river stones after a long dry season. She wasn't scanning. She wasn't talking. She was just looking at the Academy walls with an expression he couldn't file under any of his 47 species categories. Her name, according to the intake manifest, was Reyes Mara, age 26 in the human system. Specialty listed as hand-to-hand combat, tactical assessment, field improvisation. Field improvisation. There was again. The first week at the Integration Academy was orientation, which in cooperative terminology meant something closer to controlled psychological stress application. Not hazing. The cooperative had strict protocols about that, developed after the Keth incident of the 3,890th cycle, which nobody discussed openly, but which had resulted in 3 fatalities and a 17-page amendment to the Integration Charter. What orientation was a systematic exposure to everything that would be expected of you during the 6-month program, compressed into 7 days, delivered at a pace designed to make clear whether you could absorb information under duress. Most species found it overwhelming. That was the point. The human cohort found it. According to the neural stress monitors embedded in their orientation badges, which the Academy used to track cognitive load in lieu of species-specific physiological markers, moderately challenging. Daleth Voss looked at those numbers, and then looked at them again because he had a habit of assuming his equipment was malfunctioning before he assumed his data was correct. The equipment was fine. On the 3rd day of orientation, the cohort was introduced to their primary integration instructor, Commander Valesorn, a Keth. 3 meters tall, 4-limbed in the primary articulation, and 2 auxiliary, skin the color of deep ocean pressure where light had given up and gone home. 12 years of instruction at the Academy. Undefeated in the annual interspecies combat demonstration. The one where instructors went against top-performing students to demonstrate the gap between trained expertise and raw potential. The gap was generally considerable. Valesorn entered the orientation hall, and the room changed. Not metaphorically. The Keth had an involuntary resonance field when they were in a dominant posture, a subsonic vibration that most species registered physically before they registered it mentally. The Vreth cadets clicked sharply and moved back 2 steps. The Sorvani's neck frills extended. The Palori, bless them, did not run, but it was a near thing. The humans looked up. A few of them stood a little straighter. One of the males, Torres, according to the manifest, who had been laughing at something a Vreth cadet had chittered to him, stopped laughing, not in fear, but in the way that someone stops laughing when something interesting enters the room. Reyes didn't move at all. Not a flinch. Not a postural adjustment. Not even the micro-widening of the eyes that the Academy's behavioral analysts had documented across 93% of sentient species when exposed to a Keth in dominant resonance for the first time. She was still looking at Veilsorn with those flat, riverstone eyes, and her expression was Daleth Voss, watching from the observation deck, found himself leaning forward. Her expression was measuring. "Your species," Veilsorn said to the assembled cohort, and his voice was the deep low roll of something geological, has been classified at a 2.3 on the Cooperative's Cultural Volatility Index. He let that sit for a moment. The Palori scored a 6.1. I want you to think about that while we begin. He was good at this. Daleth Voss had watched him do it with 40 cohorts. Establish dominance through information, make the new species feel the weight of the Cooperative's opinion of them, see how they responded to being underestimated. Most species got angry. Anger was useful. Anger meant engagement. Torres raised his hand. "What did the Keth score?" "That information is higher than us, right?" Torres was grinning. Not nervously, just grinning. "Because I looked up the Keth in the briefing files, and the historical record suggests you all started approximately 4 wars in your first century of cooperative membership. So I'm thinking at least an 8, maybe a 9. The Vreth cadets clicked in a way that Daleth Voss, after years of exposure, had learned meant he's either very brave or very stupid, and we can't tell which. Veilsorn looked at Torres for a long moment. 12.4, he said. Torres's grin got wider. Respect. Veilsorn turned slowly and looked at the rest of the cohort, doing the thing he did where he made every individual feel personally assessed. His gaze moved along the line. Each species cadet he passed reacted, small reactions, controlled but present. He reached Reyes. She met his eyes. She said nothing. He moved on. Combat class was on the 5th day. The Academy ran it in a tiered format. First, assessment sparring within species groups to establish individual baselines, then cross-species sparring under controlled parameters to begin integration evaluation. The point wasn't to see who won. Winning between species with wildly different physiology was almost meaningless. The point was to observe method. How did a combatant think? How do they adapt? What happened when their standard approach stopped working? The human cohort's interspecies assessment was uneventful in the way that things are uneventful when nothing goes wrong, but the watching is very attentive. Daleth Voss sat in the observation bay with his senior analyst, a Veroan named Elith, and they watched. They're good, Elith said, with the mild tone of someone noting that a plant has grown. They're very good, Daleth Voss said. The 2.3 suggests the 2.3 measures aggression as policy, not capability. He was watching a human named Chun take down a significantly larger opponent using a technique that wasn't in any of the cooperative's cross-reference combat databases. Not because it was alien, it was a leverage application that any competent analyst could have reconstructed, but because it was modified in real time. Chun had started the movement with one approach and rerouted it mid-execution when the opponent's weight shifted, and the reroute was so fluid that Daleth Voss had almost missed the seam. That's improvisation, Elith said. I know. In a combat scenario. Mid-engagement. I know. They watched the rest of the cohort. The variations were significant, different styles, different physical approaches, different decision trees, but there was a consistent thread running through all of them. An adaptive quality. A willingness to discard the plan and trust the read. Then, Reyes stepped onto the mat. Her opponent was another human, a male named Park, larger, with a calm and methodical style that had been effective enough in the preceding rounds. He was good, cooperative assessment good, which meant he would have tested competitively in the standard integration metrics. Reyes stood at the center line and waited. Park moved first. What happened in the next 40 seconds would later be reviewed by the Academy's Combat Assessment Division 17 times. Not because it was flashy, it wasn't. Reyes moved with an economy that the cooperative's analysts would later describe as operationally minimal, meaning she used exactly the force required for each action and nothing beyond it. And the precision of that calibration was so consistent that it looked, on first viewing, almost like restraint. It wasn't restraint. It was control. Park was good. She was better. Not by the margin that great athletes are better than good athletes. Not that visible, thunderous gap. By the margin of someone who had studied something until the studying had gone below the level of thought and become something else. Structural. Load-bearing. Park was on the mat in under a minute. Reyes extended a hand, pulled him up, and walked back to her position on the line without expression. No celebración. No acknowledgement of the watching cadets. No performance of any kind. Daleth Voss's senior analyst made a small sound. What is her file background? Daleth Voss asked. Elith pulled it up. Read it. Read it again. Unremarkable, she said. Mid-range test scores at the Human Military Academy. No championship record in any martial category. She was never top-ranked in her class for any individual discipline. He kept his eyes on Reyes, who had found a spot on the floor a few meters from the mat, and sat down cross-legged, apparently doing nothing. Pull the surveillance footage from her orientation days, he said. All of it. What am I looking for? I don't know yet, he said. That was a lie. He knew exactly what he was looking for. He just didn't have a word for it in any language the cooperative had cataloged. He was looking for where the quiet came from. Cross-species integration sparring began in the second week. The cooperative assigned it carefully. Physiological parity was weighted, not equalized, because the point was to create manageable challenge, not injury. A Keth cadet against a Paolori would be an education in exactly one direction, which wasn't useful to either of them. A Keth against a Sorvani, both large-framed, both with equivalent reach advantage over smaller species, produced useful data. A Sorvani against a human produced interesting data, given the reach disparity. Reyes was assigned to a Sorvani cadet named Vethayar. Vethayar was, by any objective measure, exceptional. Third in the current cohort ranking. 1 meter 90 of the kind of physical architecture that made evolutionary biologists nod with satisfaction. Long limbs, dense musculature, neck frills that weren't just decorative but functioned as a threat assessment organ, reading microvibrations in the air. The Sorvani had evolved as apex predators on a world that had taken several evolutionary runs at the concept of apex predator before landing on them, and the evidence of those competing runs was visible in their physiology. They were what happened when a planet kept trying to make something scarier and kept succeeding. Vethayar outweighed Reyes by approximately 60 kilograms. He had a reach advantage of nearly 40 centimeters. His neck frills could detect her heart rate. He looked across the mat at her, with the particular expression of a creature that had been trained to be gracious about winning and was preparing to be gracious. Reyes stood at the center line. She looked at him the way she'd looked at everything since she'd arrived. The walls, the instructors, the sky, her opponents. That same flat, Riverstone measuring. Not hostile, not intimidated. Just looking. In the way you look at a problem you're deciding how to solve. The match indicator sounded. Vethayar moved. He moved the way Sorvani elite cadets moved. All momentum and structural confidence, the kind of approach that had ended most of his previous matches before they properly started. His leading hand tracked wide, which was the Sorvani way of telegraphing space control rather than concealing intent, because in most of their matchups intent didn't need to be concealed. You knew they were coming. You couldn't stop it. The knowledge was the point. Reyes moved left. Not away. Left and slightly toward, which was the thing that made Daleth Voss's analyst inhale sharply from the observation deck, because it was the one direction in which Vethayar's reach advantage was most neutralized, the one direction that the neck frills, which read vibration in a 90-degree forward arc, were least effective, and the one direction that a combatant Vethayar's size would instinctively track slowest, because nothing his size ever needed to come from that angle. It was an answer to a threat assessment that she could not have run in real-time mathematics. She had to have read it. Read him. In the 3 seconds between the starting indicator and his first movement with her flat, measuring eyes, she had to have looked at him and known those things. The match lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Longer than her intraspecies bout, because Vethayar was genuinely exceptional and adjusted twice, finding new approaches when the first and second failed. Each time, Reyes adjusted first. Not reactively, preemptively. She was always a half movement ahead, always in the position that answered the problem before the problem had fully announced itself. She took 2 clean hits. Real ones, the kind that would have ended the bout if points were the metric. She absorbed them with the flatness of someone filing information and moved on. Veth AR was controlled. Finally, face down on the mat with Reyes's weight distributed across his leverage points in a way that made further movement theoretically possible, but practically inadvisable, and he went still. The match was over. Reyes released him, stepped back, extended a hand. Veth AR, who had the grace that good warriors across species lines tend to share, took it. You knew, he said. Not an accusation. Something closer to recognition. Before I moved, Reyes was quiet for a second. Your left shoulder dropped half a centimeter before your last adjustment, she said. And your frills flattened at the trailing edge. You were reading lateral movement. So, I went lateral. Veth AR looked at her. I have never, he said slowly, had an opponent observe frill behavior in live contact. Most people are watching the hands. Everyone is watching the hands. She picked up her jacket from the edge of the mat and walked away. Word traveled the way it does in closed institutions. Fast and partially wrong. By the 3rd day after the Veth AR match, everyone in the cohort knew something. The Vreth cadets had stopped clicking in her direction with a specific frequency that indicated amusement at smaller beings. The Palori, who were socially perceptive in ways that their CVI wildly undersold, had begun saving her a seat at the morning training assembly, which among the Palori was a gesture of significant trust. Veilsorn said nothing publicly. In private, he called Daleth Voss. I want to run the annual demonstration early, he said. Daleth Voss, who had been doing paperwork and had put it down the moment he saw who was calling, said, the demonstration isn't scheduled until the 6th week. I know when it's scheduled. A pause. Which cadet? Daleth Voss asked. You know which one? He did. Veilsorn. She's been here 3 weeks. The demonstration is voluntary. Cadet initiated. She hasn't initiated it. I'm going to give her the option. She could decline. Veilsorn was quiet for a moment in the particular way that Keth were quiet when they were thinking something through on a level below conversation. She won't decline. How do you know? Because I've been watching her the way she watches everyone else. Another pause. She's been watching me since the first day. He offered it the following morning, in the training hall, in front of the assembled cohort. Not dramatically. Not as a challenge. The regulations were clear that it couldn't be framed as a challenge, because that would activate about 6 different honor response protocols in 4 different species simultaneously and turn a demonstration into a diplomatic incident. He framed it as an educational opportunity. Veilsorn against a self-selected cadet volunteer, for assessment purposes, open to any cadet who felt their integration training had progressed to a point where the matchup would yield useful data. He said it looking at the room. Every cadet in the room knew he was saying it to one person. Torres looked at Reyes. Reyes was looking at Veilsorn. I'll do it, she said. Her voice was the same as it always was, flat, not quite monotone, no particular inflection. The kind of voice that required you to read the person rather than the delivery, which Daleth Voss had come to understand was entirely intentional, because Reyes gave very little away by voice as a matter of practice. Veilsorn nodded. Tomorrow morning. 06:00. Fine. That was it. She walked out first, which was unusual. Normally the cohort waited for the instructor to leave, and nobody moved until she was gone. Torres turned to the Vreth cadet beside him. She's going to do it, he said, with the tone of someone who had watched a friend walk into something that might go badly and was not actually sure it was going to go badly. The Vreth cadet clicked something. Yeah, Torres said. That's what I'm saying. Daleth Voss did not sleep well that night. This wasn't unusual. He was at the age in his species' lifespan where sleep became more negotiation than rest. But the particular quality of his wakefulness that night was different from the ordinary kind. He lay in the dark of his quarters and ran the mathematics, which was something he did when he was troubled. It helped him feel located. Veilsorn was 3 meters of evolved combat architecture, 12 years of instruction. undefeated in the demonstration for the full duration of his posting, across 42 cohorts, against hundreds of cadets from dozens of species, including, twice, Keth cadets who had specifically come to the academy ranked as the top combat prospects in their generation. Reyes was 26 years old. She had been training in a program that hadn't officially existed for 3 weeks. Before that, she had spent 4 years in a human military program that the cooperative had assessed as structurally sound but technologically primitive, and before that she had apparently spent most of her documented history being unremarkable. The mathematics were obvious. He had spent 18 years at this academy watching the mathematics be obvious. He thought about her eyes, river stones, measuring. He thought about her voice. Your left shoulder dropped half a centimeter. He thought about the way she moved onto the mat. Not like someone performing confidence, but like someone carrying something so familiar it had become part of their physical weight. The mathematics were obvious. He wasn't sure he trusted the mathematics. 0600 on Vethcor, in the grade before the second sun. The training hall held 108 cadets from 12 species. Plus de vos. Plus every senior instructor on post, because word had reached them through the same channels that word reached everyone. Fast and partially wrong, but wrong in the direction of you should see this, which meant enough people showed up that the observation gallery was standing room by 0545. Veilsorn was already on the mat when the cohort arrived. He was in the standing, resting posture of his species, which in a Keth of his size looked less like resting and more like a cliff face deciding whether it was in a hurry. He wore the standard gray instruction uniform with no insignia, which was protocol for the demonstration. The point was to remove rank signals, because the demonstration was supposed to test the cadet against an opponent, not against a symbol. Reyes came in with the rest of the cohort and split off without ceremony. She was wearing the same cadet gray. No modification. No preparation ritual that Daleth Vos could observe. He'd watched other cadets in the hours before a difficult bout, seen every variety of pre-competition routine that sentient biology had invented, and she had apparently done none of them, or had done them privately and invisibly, which he was coming to understand was her primary operational mode. She walked to the mat. She stopped at the edge. She looked at Veilsorn for a moment with those flat, measuring eyes, and for 1 second, just one, something moved across her face that wasn't calculation. It was brief and unreadable, and then it was gone. She stepped onto the mat. What happened in the next 6 minutes would be parsed, reconstructed, and argued over by the Cooperative's Combat Assessment Division for the better part of the following decade. Not because Reyes won. She didn't. Not technically. Not by the scoring parameters. Veilsorn landed points. Controlled exchanges. His size and training and 12 years of doing exactly this in exactly this room was real, and it was visible, and it was effective in the moments where it was allowed to be effective. The problem was the moments when it wasn't. Veilsorn's first 3 approaches were answered. Not just avoided, answered. Each time he moved, Reyes was already somewhere else, and the somewhere else was always the specific position from which she could do the most damage to his next move rather than just surviving the current one. She was fighting the fight that was 2 exchanges ahead. She was solving a problem he hadn't presented yet. He adjusted. He was exceptional. That was real. She adjusted first. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, Veilsorn did something that he had never done in 42 demonstrations across 12 years. He committed fully. Not a probe, not an assessment movement. He committed the way a Keth commits, which involved every kilogram of his mass and every year of his training and the full expression of what his species had been built to do. Reyes moved. What she did in the next 4 seconds was not in any combat database the cooperative had cataloged. Not because it was alien technique. The mechanics were reconstructible, derivable, logical in retrospect. But the decision tree that produced it was wrong. Entirely wrong by any conventional analysis. She was smaller, slower by raw mass physics. She should have moved away. She moved into it. She used his momentum. All of it. Every kilogram. She found the geometry that turned his full commitment into a lever with herself at the fulcrum, and she redirected. Not deflected, not blocked, redirected like rerouting a river rather than damming it. And Veilsorn, 3 meters of evolved combat architecture and 12 years of undefeated demonstration, hit the mat with a sound like a sentence ending. The hall was absolutely silent. Dalit Vos realized he was standing. He didn't remember standing up. On the mat, Reyes was standing over Veilsorn with her arm extended in the position that indicated controlled restraint. The formal signal that the bout was decided, that she had the option to continue and was choosing not to exercise it. It was the correct form. Precise. By the book. Veilsorn was still for 3 full seconds. Then he began to rise, and Reyes stepped back and extended a hand, and he took it, and he was looking at her the way he had looked 12 years ago at the first thing in the training hall that had genuinely surprised him. Nobody in the observation gallery made a sound. Then, Torres said, from somewhere in the middle of the assembled cadets, in the carrying voice of someone who has been waiting with heroic patience to say exactly one thing, 2.3. And the hall. Vreth clicking, Sorvani frills flared, Palori making the low melodic sound that was their species' equivalent of exhale breath. Keth cadets standing straighter in the particular way that Keth stood when something had demonstrated that it deserved to be stood straight at. The hall broke open. Veilsorn was still holding Reyes's hand. He turned it slightly, looked at it. Where did that come from? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. That was normal. She was always quiet for a moment. My grandmother, she said. He waited. She didn't elaborate. He understood, then, that she wasn't going to. That night, in his office, Dalit Vos wrote a report that he flagged for Arbiter Prime Sevicolin's attention. He didn't often flag reports for the Arbiter Prime. He had in 18 years flagged for. The report was titled, Reassessment Recommendation, Human Integration Cohort, Cycle 4412. He wrote it carefully. He documented the assessment sparring results. He documented the Veth-AR match. He documented the demonstration. He included the sensor data and the combat assessment footage and his own observations, time-stamped. And then he sat for a long time looking at the summary field, which was the part the Arbiter Prime would read first, and possibly only, because she was a busy person running an institution that processed 11,000 species and found Tuesdays ironic. He wrote, Asterisk, the 2.3 CVI rating for the human species represents a category error. We have been measuring aggression as policy and mistaking its absence for incapability. The humans are not 2.3. I do not yet have the correct number. I'm not sure a scale goes that high. Asterisk, he sent it. He looked out his window at the gray Vitsar night, and he thought about a 26-year-old human girl standing in the center of the training hall with her hand extended, unhurried, saying nothing. He thought about the thing that had moved across her face in the second before she stepped onto the mat. He put a name to it, finally. It wasn't nerves. It wasn't calculation. It was recognition. The expression of someone who had encountered a problem they had spent their whole life preparing for without knowing that was what they were doing. The expression of someone who understood, in their bones, in a specific way that things become load-bearing, that this moment was the one that all the previous moments had been pointing at. He turned off his light. In the hall below, through the walls, he could hear the cadets. All 12 species. The clicking and the subsonic hum and the Pelori's melodic sound and the noise of humans laughing at something he couldn't hear. He sat in the dark and listened. The report reached Arbiter Prime Sevicolin on a Wednesday. She read it twice, set it down, picked it up, and read it again, which was not a habit she had developed in 2 centuries of institutional life, and which therefore told her something important about the state of her attention. She did not immediately respond. What she did, instead, was pull the human provisional membership file, the full file, not the intake summary she'd reviewed 2 years ago, and read it the way she had not read it the first time. Slowly, in the language of someone looking for what they missed, not for confirmation of what they already thought. The file was full of numbers that didn't mean anything by themselves, and everything in context. Human lifespan, approximately 80 years at current medical standard. Short, dramatically short by cooperative species comparison. The Veruin ran 400. The Keth ran 300. The Vreth, whom most people forgot because they spent most of their lifespan in larval stages, ran 700 if you counted from egg laying, which the Vreth very much insisted you should. 80 years. She kept coming back to that number. 80 years to develop language, civilization, agriculture, mathematics, philosophy, art, medicine, industrialization, nuclear capability, space travel, and a military program that produced cadets who could take down a 12-year undefeated Keth combat instructor in their third week. 80 years. She pulled comparative developmental timelines. The Keth had required 600 cycles from agricultural civilization to first orbital flight. The Sorvani, 1200. The Veruan, her own species, the cooperative's founders, the civilization that had built the institution that processed 11,000 species across millennia, had required 900 cycles from agricultural civilization to first orbital flight. The humans had done it in 200. She put the file down and looked at the wall. There was a word in the Veruan language for which no cooperative translation existed, because it described a state so specific to their culture that no other civilization had needed a word for it. It was Verith, and it referred to the moment when a certainty you had constructed over a long time revealed itself to be a ceiling you had mistaken for the sky. She was having a Verith. She pulled up a comm channel. Proctor Daleth Voss, she said when he answered. I have a question. Arbiter Prime. The girl. Reyes. In your professional assessment. Yes, he said, before she finished the question. She paused. You don't know what I was going to ask. You were going to ask if she's representative of her species or an anomaly. A beat. Yes. I've been asking the same question for 3 weeks, he said. I've been watching the rest of the human cohort more carefully since the demonstration, running comparative analyses. A pause. She's exceptional by human standards. Make no mistake about that. But the quality she demonstrates, the adaptive assessment, the pre-reading, the calm, that's not unique to her. That's in the rest of them. Different registers, different magnitudes, but structurally they all have it. Sevikolin was quiet for a long moment. Why, she asked. What produces it? The short lifespan, he said, with the certainty of someone who had already run the argument and found it held. Think about it, Arbiter Prime. 80 years. They have 80 years to become everything they're going to be. They can't specialize slowly. They don't have the time. They can't learn one thing and trust that there will be cycles remaining to learn another. Every human alive is developing under a pressure that none of our long-lived species has ever experienced. They are in a perpetual state of urgency that they themselves don't fully recognize because it has always been the water they swim in. That should produce panic, Sevikolin said. Not calm. It should, he agreed. Until you realize that they've been managing that urgency for every generation of their existence. It's not panic for them. It's just a baseline. The calm isn't absence of urgency. It's what urgency looks like after 10,000 years of living inside it. She sat with that. Daleth Voss, Arbiter Prime, begin the process of reassessment for the human CVI classification. Flag it for Defense Strategic Board review. A pause. The Defense Strategic Board, not the Developmental Committee. That's what I said. Arbiter Prime. That will require a full cooperative council briefing. The political implications, I'm aware, will be significant. There are factions who have built policy frameworks around the 2.3 assessment. Reclassification will Daleth Voss. Her voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that had run 2 centuries of institutional command. Begin the process. He was silent for a moment. Yes, Arbiter Prime. The Defense Strategic Board reviewed the reassessment file in the 4413 cycle, 14 months after Reyes stepped onto that mat in the gray Vethsior morning. It was not the smoothest council session in the cooperative's history. The Sorvani delegation objected on procedural grounds, not because they doubted the assessment Daleth Voss suspected, but because reclassification moved the humans from interesting developmental case to strategic consideration, which was a category that required the cooperative to revise 17 standing treaties for border agreements and 1 military mutual aid compact that the Sorvani were currently very comfortable with exactly as it was. The Keth delegation said nothing, which among the Keth was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Veilsorn, who had been asked to give testimony to the board. The first time in the Academy's history that an instruction staff member had been invited to address the Defense Strategic Board, stood in front of the assembled representatives of 47 civilizations and said, with the geological patience of a species, the following: I have been teaching combat integration for 12 years. I have been undefeated in the demonstration for the full duration of that posting. I was trained by the best combat instructors my species has produced in 3 generations. I was defeated in 6 minutes by a 26-year-old human in her 3rd week of provisional integration training. He paused. She offered me her hand afterward. Another pause. I am recommending full defense, strategic classification, expedited partnership track, and cross-species combat curriculum integration with specific focus on human adaptive assessment methodology. If you would like to understand why, he looked at the assembled board with the expression of someone who has already done the arguing in his head, and found it won easily. I suggest you ask her. They did ask her. Reyes sat in front of the Defense Strategic Board in a room large enough to intimidate most delegations, with representatives of 47 civilizations looking at her from tiered galleries, and she looked back at them with those flat, Riverstone eyes, and she was quiet for a moment in the way that it stopped seeming like silence and started seeming like something else. Cadet Reyes, said the board's presiding chair, a Veruan elder named Corsitha, who had served the board for a century and had interviewed everything from planetary defense ministers to field-decorated veterans. The board has reviewed your integration assessments and combat demonstration records. We have some questions. All right, said Reyes. The technique you used to neutralize instructor Veilsorn, the redirection in the 6th period of the demonstration. Our combat analysts have reviewed the footage 17 times. The decision to move into the attack rather than away from it runs contrary to every biomechanical efficiency model we have for species of your mass class. Can you explain your reasoning? Reyes looked at Corsitha. He was committed, she said. When someone commits fully, the force is already in motion. You can't stop it. So stopping was never the option. You find where it's going and you get there first and you turn it. But the risk of stepping away was higher. He'd have adjusted and come back with the same force, and I'd have been further out of position. A pause. It was the only geometry that worked. You calculated that in real time? I didn't calculate it, she said. I just knew where I had to be. Corsitha was quiet for a moment. How did you develop this skill? Reyes thought about this for a second. I learned from my grandmother, she said. She said the most important thing you could do in a fight was listen. Not to what someone was doing, to what they were about to do. She paused. She wasn't a soldier. She was a weaver. She said the thread always tells you where it wants to go before it moves. You just have to be paying attention. The board was quiet. Your grandmother, Corsitha said, taught you combat methodology through textiles. She taught me listening, Reyes said. I found the application myself. The reclassification passed. The new human CVI was not in the end a number. Daleth Voss had been right. The scale didn't go there, or rather the scale had been designed to measure the wrong thing, and no modification of the existing metric could capture what it was trying to measure. What they put in the file, eventually, after 3 sessions of increasingly agitated committee discussion, was a notation that the CVI for human civilization should be understood as contextually variable, meaning it moved depending on what the humans were responding to, what they were protecting, and how long they'd been paying attention. A cooperative historian, reviewing the file a century later, would add a footnote observing that this notation was the cooperative's way of saying, *, we don't have the right number yet. We may not have a right scale. Watch this space. * on the last day of the Integration Academy's first human cohort cycle, there was a ceremony. Graduation ceremonies at the Academy were ancient and specific, each species contributing something from their own tradition, woven into a formal structure that was the cooperative's best attempt at meaning that could hold multiple cultures simultaneously. The Vreth clicked in harmony. The Sorvani sang one long, sustained frequency that everyone felt in their sternum. The Paulori read a passage from their 7th book of arbitration, which was the one about beginning well. The humans were asked to contribute something. Torres had been the one talking to the Academy's planning committee, and he'd been cagey about what they were going to do. The other species cadets had asked. He'd smiled and said, "You'll see." They stood in a row, all 12 of them, in the formal ceremony space. And they were quiet. Not performatively, not the silence of people doing a silence. Just the natural quiet of people who had decided not to fill a moment, who understood that some things were louder when they were held still. 40 seconds of it. And then all 12 of them, together, they inclined their heads. The deep bow of a species that knew what it was worth. Daleth Voss, watching from the third row, felt something he didn't have an immediate word for. Something in the chest. Something load-bearing. He looked at Reyes, who was in the center of the line, and she was looking straight ahead in the middle of the bow, and there was something on her face he recognized now. The thing he'd seen in the second before she stepped onto the mat. Recognition of a moment that all the other moments had been pointing at. She felt him looking. Glanced sideways. Caught his eye. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Arbiter Prime Sevicolin lived for another 200 years after the reclassification. She never stopped thinking about the 2.3. Not with regret, or not only with regret. With the particular quality of attention that comes from a mistake that teaches you something structural about how you've been thinking. The 2.3 hadn't been a bad number given what she'd been measuring. It had been a bad measurement. She'd been looking at the absence of aggression as policy and reading it as incapability, when what it actually was, what she now understood it was something she had no better word for than patience operating at the species level. The humans did not announce themselves when threatened. They went quiet. They looked at the problem with flat, measuring eyes. And then they found the geometry that worked. She had spent 200 years in an institution that had processed 11,206 civilizations, and she had never encountered anything quite like it. She was not, in her assessment of the cooperative's future, afraid. But she was, and she held this word carefully because it was the right word, and she had earned the right to use it precisely, attentive. The humans had been patient. The galaxy was still learning what that meant. There's an old human saying that the cooperative's translation division struggled with for years, because it doesn't have a clean equivalent in any of the 11,000 languages they have cataloged asterisk, still waters run deep. Asterisk it refers, as near as the translators could determine, to the specific phenomenon in which the absence of surface disturbance indicates not shallowness, but the kind of depth that has no need to announce itself. Asterisk the cooperative has since adopted the phrase. Asterisk it is, in the current cycle. Most commonly used when someone asks a new analyst what they need to understand about the humans before they begin their posting. Asterisk the answer is always the same asterisk still waters. Asterisk watch what's underneath. Asterisk.